There's no need for Israel to exist. Everything was good for Jews when they lived under Arab rule. You mean like this? Or like this? Doesn't dhimmi status mean structural discrimination in the legal system? And what about what happened outside the legal system? Welcome back, and thank you for wanting to know the facts and the truth. What's going on in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is big. You can't miss it on the news. You can't miss it on college campuses, and you really can't miss it online. But what are the facts? Why is this happening? That's what we're here to answer. Our approach is to examine the major themes and focus on the important events that help you make sense of what's happening today. We care about knowing the truth. We also care about the basic human right to live in peace. We care about ending the suffering. We care about finding justice. And we think you're here because you do too. The only path for us then is to go after the facts and be open to what they show us. Life can be beautiful without hatred, violence, and war, and maybe the way there starts with better understanding each other. Better understanding the Jewish people, the Palestinian people, the history of their conflicts and past peace efforts, and some of the major issues standing in the way of forging real peace. What the Hell is Going On in Gaza is a 9-part series made up of 30 episodes, each designed to help you understand a different but important part of the picture. As part 1 of our series continues, our focus stays on answering some basic questions about Israel. Here in episode 5, we'll look at the question of whether the centuries that Jews lived under Muslim rule were centuries of peace or persecution. Let's dig in and find out what the truth is. Okay, here's the reality. The myth that before 1948, Jews living in Arab lands were treated well or were perfectly content just isn't true. But before we get to that, we should be clear about what we mean when we say Arab lands and what sort of Jewish presence was in them. Arab lands meant an enormous area. It encompassed the whole of the Arabian Peninsula, all of North Africa, and south to Somalia. And Jews lived in all these countries. In fact, Judaism had been the majority religion in some of them before the Arab conquest and imposition of Islam. All of the countries on our map of the Arab world were home to significant Jewish populations before 1948. In total, nearly 1 million Jews lived in these places. A lot of people, a large area, and it was also a long time, from the 7th century Arab conquest of this region to the State of Israel's founding in 1948 was some 1,300 years. The point is that the Jewish experience living under Arab rule in the Arab lands was one of difficulty, hardship, and suffering, and today that is well understood. Well understood because it was thoroughly documented by Jews, Arabs, and others. It's not a mystery, and aside from the claims of anti-Israel activists, it's really not in dispute. Jews in the Arab world had dhimmi status, making them second-class citizens at best. They were allowed to live, but only if they surrendered, were loyal, and paid taxes. The reality was they were subjected to discrimination, abuse, and pogroms. The following quote is a bit of a long explanation, but it's helpful to understand what dhimmi status meant. The dhimmi status of non-Muslims was mandated by the 7th century Covenant of Omar, after Muhammad defeated the non-Muslims living in the Arabian Peninsula. Basically, it stated that Christians and Jews would be spared their lives provided they obeyed certain conditions. Notably, the Jews had to pay a special tax and were not allowed to be armed or defend themselves. The system recalls a mafia-style racket. You pay protection money to the ruler. The other characteristics of dhimmi status was that Jews and Christians had to abide by certain humiliating restrictions in order to be free to practice their religion. A Jew's testimony was worth half that of a Muslim in court. Jews had to wear certain clothing or colored patches, live in certain areas, and so on. A few of the specifics about the Jewish experience as dhimmis are also helpful. In Morocco, Libya, and Algeria, Jews were forced to live in ghettos or mellahs. In Yemen and Iraq, Jews at times were forced to choose between conversion to Islam and death. blood libels and other false accusations led to massive rioting, and in the 1930s and 1940s, Nazi-inspired massacres took place against Jews in Libya and Algeria, most infamously in Baghdad, known as the Farhud. The Farhud took place in Iraq in 1941. Iraqi Arabs attacked Iraqi Jews in Baghdad, brutally murdering at least 180. Thousands more were wounded and raped, and Jewish shops and synagogues were plundered and destroyed. Attacks on Jews have occurred in many other places in the Arab world, long before Israel's independence in 1948. This famous painting depicts the execution of a young Jewish woman for refusing to convert to Islam in 1834. She was beheaded in Fez, Morocco. Let's go through a couple. First, Tunisia. Here are a few quotes from Wikipedia. 1. During the 17th and 18th centuries, Jews were still subjected to bullying and discriminatory measures, particularly on the part of the judicial system. 2. At the beginning of the 18th century, poor Jews were often victims of bullying and even murder, and the authorities didn't seem to intervene. 3. At the end of the 18th century, Hamuda Pasha denied Jews the right to acquire and possess real estate properties. 4. Jews of Arab Lands, Their History and Maps by Martin Gilbert chronicles pogroms against Jews in Tunisia in 1869, 1880, 1881, 1917, and 1932. Morocco. Again, according to the Jews of Arab Lands, Their History and Maps, under Arab rule, 6,000 Jews were slaughtered in Fez in 1033, and more in Marrakesh in 1232. And more pogroms against Jews happened in Demnat in 1875 and 1884, and in Sefru in 1890. Between 1864 and 1880, 500 Jews in Morocco were murdered, many in broad daylight on city streets. According to Stand With Us, pogroms occurred in Taza in 1903, and 30 Jews were murdered, and 200 women and children were kidnapped, raped, and ransomed in 1907 in Casablanca. More recently, according to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, 60 Jews were murdered, and the Jewish quarter of Fez ransacked in 1912, and more pogroms occurred in Oujda and Jarada in 1938. Algeria. Pogroms against Jews in Algeria occurred in 1897 in Oran, and in 1898, when over 158 Jewish-owned shops were looted and burned and Jews killed while the army refused to intervene. In 1934 in Constantine, 25 Jews were killed, and some 200 stores were pillaged. According to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, in 1929 to 1930, many incidents between Arabs and Jews occurred in several towns in the Constantine area. And during the 1934 pogrom in Constantine, which was carried out in the name of jihad, soldiers watched but did not intervene. At the time, the Jewish Telegraph Agency reported, "The only comparison I can think of is the Palestine riots of 1929. I found Jewish girls with their breasts cut off, gray-bearded Jews stabbed to death, little Jewish children dead of numerous knife wounds, and whole families locked in their homes and burned to death by the rioters." Other pogroms against Jews were carried out in 1934 in Turkey, 1942 in Libya, where 2,000 Jews fled into the desert and died, and again in Libya in 1945, when 100 more Jews were murdered. In Egypt, multiple riots occurred between 1882 and 1924, and again in 1945. And in Syria, a 1947 pogrom resulted in 75 Jews being murdered, hundreds more injured, and more than 200 Jewish homes, shops, and synagogues destroyed. These are just a few examples. This treatment of Jews occurred all across the Arab world. The point is that Jews did not, in fact, live happily under Arab rule. They suffered discrimination, hardship, and persecution. The early relationship between Jews and Arabs who conquered the whole region was difficult. As Eli Kavan wrote in the Jerusalem Post in March 2020, The institutional humiliation of Jews under Islam was enshrined in the Pact of Umar, dating back to the 9th century. The Muslims forbade Jews from converting Muslims to Judaism, building new synagogues, making a display of their rituals, living in houses higher than those of Muslims, carrying weapons, and they were forbidden to ride horses. Jews under these dhimmi rules had to wear distinctive clothing and pay a substantial poll tax and a land tax. Across the vast Arab empire and across many centuries of Arab rule, sometimes life for Jews was better than the Pact of Umar dictated, and sometimes it was much, much worse. This long history, which darkened in the early 20th century, set the stage for much worse after 1948. Between 1948 and 1951, the violent Arab response to Israel's independence led to significant numbers of Jews living under Arab rule to flee to Israel. When Jews were chased from every Arab country, their losses were significant. Approximately $1.5 billion in wealth was stolen or had to be abandoned as Jews fled the Arab world. These numbers continued to grow as the Arab world increasingly punished Jews for the repeated failure of Arabs to destroy Israel in wars Arabs started. Ultimately, there were more Jewish refugees from Arab nations than Arab refugees from Israel, and almost no Jews left anywhere in the Arab world. Thanks for watching episode 5 in part 1 of our series, What the Hell is Going On in Gaza? We hope it was helpful and you now understand better what life was actually like for Jews under centuries of Arab rule in the Middle East. If you'd like to leave a comment or get in touch, visit our website at www.getthefactsmiddleeast.com. This was just a start. Episode 6 is next. We'll look at Israel's conduct in fighting Hamas and answer the question, is it genocide or self-defense? Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your interest in learning more about the war in Gaza. And remember, where there is no knowledge, there can be no insight.